Gingerbread cookies already have a very spicy taste and aroma on their own. That's why we add just a small hint of essential oils to the icing itself. But believe me, this completely changes the way you experience this dessert. And now, I'm going to teach you how to make gingerbread cookies enriched with the taste and aroma of lavender. Gingerbread is a very old recipe with a rich culture and its own history. There are countless varieties among different peoples. The types of gingerbread and gingerbread dough that we know and love today are actually a more modern interpretation. There are mainly a few technological types of gingerbread dough. There is the cold method and the hot method. We will be using a combined method because, as I mentioned before, the modern classification of gingerbread dough uses a hybrid approach. We'll be heating the honey mixture, but the eggs will be mixed separately with the sugar. They will be gradually incorporated into the mixture once it's ready, rather than being heated together with it. To make honey gingerbread dough, we'll need flour. Ordinary. It's best to use flour with a lower protein content. What is protein? Where can you find this information? You can read it on the flour package, where the nutritional information is listed. There is a description of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. You're interested in the protein section. Most of the flour you can find in stores these days contains about 10 to 10.5 grams of protein on average. This type of flour is perfect for making gingerbread, and it's also great for cookies and all kinds of sponge cake batters. Flour with a higher protein content is harder to find. Mostly, what I've seen in stores is around 11 to 11.5 grams of protein. That kind of flour is needed for making more complex doughs, like eclairs or choux pastry. That's why we're specifically interested in weak flour. That's the term for flour with a protein content not exceeding 10.5 grams. We'll also need regular sugar. In this recipe, you can substitute it with dark cane sugar or even another type of sugar, like coconut sugar. In this case, they are interchangeable. We'll also need butter. Make sure to choose butter with a fat content of over 82%. The thing is, butter with a lower fat percentage isn't really butter anymore. That is, these are some types of oils with impurities. It could be margarine, or it could be a spread. If you want to get a quality result in any baked goods where butter is required or is the main ingredient, always choose butter with a fat content above 82.5%. We'll also need eggs and honey. The honey can be floral or have a more robust flavor, like buckwheat honey. It works great in all honey-based baked goods, not just gingerbread, but also honey cakes. It gives the product a richer, more distinctive taste. In this case, we'll be using regular floral honey. We'll also need a spice mix. The most common one used in gingerbread dough is a blend of cinnamon, a small amount of ginger, and sometimes nutmeg. This is the basic minimum that goes in. The spices in gingerbread are properly called dry perfumes, but dry perfumes can include a wider range of spices, like cardamom and some more complex spices. That already depends on your taste. For our gingerbread, which we'll be pairing with our secret ingredient, namely essential oils, it's best not to overload the dough itself with too many aromatic spices. So, choose the minimal set. Basically, cinnamon and ginger will be more than enough to make the dough tasty and aromatic. And we'll also need baking soda. Why baking soda specifically? People often ask why some types of dough use baking powder, while others use baking soda. What's the difference between them? Actually, the difference is that baking soda is the ingredient from which baking powder is made. It contains citric acid in dry form, some baking soda, and a stabilizer that keeps these two ingredients from mixing and reacting too soon. Most often, this stabilizer is a type of starch, ideally, or sometimes flour. In the worst case, it could be some kind of anti-caking agents. So, be sure to carefully choose the brand of baking powder you use, the one that works best for you. The main thing is that it gives consistent results. If possible, check the ingredients list on the package. Most of the time, the manufacturer will indicate what is used as the stabilizer. So, what's the difference between baking soda and baking powder? If baking soda is a pure ingredient that works in an acidic environment, then baking powder is a substance designed to start working and activate where there is no acidic environment. That's why in honey cakes and gingerbread type dough, we always use baking soda, because soda reacts very strongly with honey. Since honey has an acidic environment, because it's a natural sugar and contains acids produced by bees during the honey making process. So, the reaction is guaranteed. We don't use baking powder here because, first of all, it wouldn't be enough, since the ratio of baking powder to baking soda is about 1:2. So, for example, if we need to use 5 grams of baking soda, then for that amount, we would need to double it for baking powder. In other words, we would need to use 10 grams of baking powder. So, if you replace baking soda with baking powder, you end up needing a lot more of it. Or rather, if you replace baking powder with baking soda, then you'd have to use a lot more baking powder. This can negatively affect the taste of the product. Plus, it just won't be strong enough, because it will start reacting with the acidic environment. Also, since it already has its own acidic note, we simply won't get the rise we need. When making gingerbread, out of all the ingredients we have, we need to understand that they are divided into 3 bases, which we will prepare in advance. The first thing we'll start with is the flour. In general, get into the habit that when you're working with dough that requires adding baking soda, baking powder, or any dry additives, you should always mix all of these together with the flour in one container ahead of time. Because, trust me, if you put this off until later, most likely at the most crucial moment you'll remember that you forgot to add the baking soda, spices, or some other dry ingredient that should be in the recipe. So start with the flour. You measure out the flour, and then add in some of the spices. Why only some? The thing is, spices can be incorporated into 2 different bases in gingerbread dough. If you want to bring out their flavor as much as possible, add them to the hot mixture of honey and sugar, pure honey, or honey with butter, whatever base you're heating up. If you like spices but, for example, don't want to reduce their amount or want to slightly tone down their aroma and flavor, then add them to the dry mixture. That way, you'll still taste them, but they won't fully reveal their potential and will be fairly mild. So I add a little bit to the dough, and set aside some to add to the base where we'll have the honey. Now, make sure to add all the baking soda here. After that, we use a whisk to mix our dry ingredients very thoroughly and well. First and foremost, this is to make sure the baking soda is distributed as evenly as possible throughout the flour mixture. Because if the baking soda isn't mixed well, then later in the dough, some areas will have a higher concentration and others will have less. And this, in turn, will affect how the product rises and its overall texture. That's why we mix it well. The second base is honey, which we've already measured out into our saucepan for convenience, and where we add the remaining spices. Then we put it on medium, or just above medium, heat to warm up. Another very important point when working with honey is to remember that this product does not tolerate excessive heat treatment. In other words, under no circumstances should honey be boiled for a long time or forcefully. First of all, it loses its aromatic qualities, and part of its flavor also weakens. And on top of that, honey that is overheated or boiled develops unwanted harmful substances that, later on, can affect the body. The only thing to keep in mind is that, of course, Any truly harmful effect might only happen if you eat it in huge amounts all at once. Well, because I think everyone knows, there's a confection called nougat. And nougat is made using a thick syrup boiled with honey and sugar. So in that case, the honey undergoes prolonged boiling. But, many desserts have these kinds of nuances. In this case, we won't be boiling the honey. Our goal is to heat it up just until it starts to boil. Stir it well, but not actually boil it. Just take it off the heat right away. Again, pay very close attention to what kind of stove you have. If you're using a regular gas burner, remember that the heat is distributed around the outer ring, meaning the center heats up more slowly while the edges heat up much more intensely. As a result, the edges might start to boil or even burn, while the center is just barely reaching the right temperature. So, when stirring on a gas stove while heating something up, start by stirring and working from the edges of the pot, then move back toward the center. But if you have an electric stove or an induction cooktop, in that case, especially with induction, the heating happens instantly and evenly. So here, you also need to be extra careful not to overheat or boil the mixture. The first sign that the honey is starting to reach the boiling stage is that you'll notice a very strong honey aroma, along with the spices we've added to the honey. The honey has started to boil. Stir it a little until it boils evenly, then remove it from the heat. Now we add our butter to the mixture. It can be either very soft or cold, but preferably not straight from the fridge. So let it sit at room temperature for at least half an hour. That will be more than enough. Now we need to mix the mixture thoroughly so that the butter melts and blends in. If, while mixing the butter into the mixture, you notice some separation happening, for example, you see that the butter isn't blending properly with the honey and is forming layers instead, and mixing doesn't fix it, unfortunately. You've chosen low-quality butter. Sometimes, even if the butter says 82.5% fat, that's not always a reliable indicator of its quality. Again, choose a brand that you feel comfortable working with and stick with it. That's it, our base is ready. It needs to cool down a bit, since we're about to work with the third base. This will be our eggs and sugar. We need to make an egg and sugar mixture and beat it until it's light and frothy, so it's ready to be combined with our honey mixture. You need to beat the mixture thoroughly so that all the sugar dissolves completely and the mixture becomes fluffy. We're working with it the same way we would when beating sugar and eggs for a sponge cake. The mixture is almost ready. If you're using a hand mixer and you run it along the bottom, and you still hear the sugar scraping or see small sugar crystals on the sides, keep beating. For eggs to beat better with sugar, whether it's for a sponge cake, gingerbread dough, or any other recipe, they need to be at room temperature. Either you take them out in advance and let them sit for a few hours to reach room temperature. Or there's another quick method. You take a container, Fill it with water that should be pleasantly warm, not hot, but not cold either. When you test it with your finger, it should feel very comfortable. A little warmer than just warm, but definitely not hot. Put the eggs in there and leave them for about 10 minutes, 15 at most. So, by the time the water reaches room temperature, the eggs inside will also warm up and be at room temperature. It's a very quick method if you forgot to take the eggs out ahead of time. Alright, our mixture is ready. Also keep in mind that eggs at room temperature whip up into a more stable, fluffy, and fully stable foam with sugar compared to cold eggs. This happens because of the yolks. The thing is, the yolk in the egg is fat, and when it gets warmer, it becomes much more pliable and easier to whip. In other words, it helps create a fluffier and more stable foam. It's better to mix the honey mixture into the eggs by hand rather than using a mixer so that the eggs we've whipped into a fluffy foam don't lose their volume. Also, the mixture must cool down to a comfortable temperature for the eggs so they don't curdle. Now, with gentle movements, you can use a spatula or a whisk, stir either counterclockwise or clockwise, whichever is more comfortable for you depending on whether you're right or left-handed, turning the bowl as you go, and carefully fold the honey mixture into the egg mixture along the edge. And now we have the final step. We need to combine both mixtures. Look, depending on which recipes you prefer or like, there's an important detail. If we're using the custard method, then in that case we pour the hot mixture into the dry ingredients and mix it together. But in our case, we're using a combined hybrid method, so we do the opposite. We take the dry mixture and add it to our honey egg mixture. After that, carefully, preferably with a spatula or a suitable spoon, we mix the two mixtures together. Mix gently. Try to do this quickly and efficiently. It's also very important to understand that when both mixtures come together and you get a dough, don't be alarmed by its consistency. In other words, do you see what it looks like? It might seem like you don't have enough flour or that you did something wrong. Actually, that's not the case. Everything is just as it should be. The thing is, this dough needs to go through a long stabilization process. It's prepared in advance. So, you can't just make and knead this dough and then bake the gingerbread an hour later. Unfortunately, no. It absolutely needs to rest in the refrigerator for 10, or even better, 12 hours. During this period, the dough will gain mass, the flour inside will fully activate, it will become dense, and it will stop being so pasty. Under no circumstances should you add more flour. Don't try to make it denser right away. If you do, you'll overload the dough with flour, and trust me, you won't get a quality product. That is, there will be more flour than necessary. And naturally, that will ruin the taste. Why did the dough turn out so runny? We have to remember that we used honey and butter, melted them, and brought them to a liquid state. So, while they're still warm, don't make the dough more liquid. And after the full stabilization process in the fridge is complete, after 12 hours, the butter will cool, the honey will set, the flour will swell, and the dough will reach the right and proper consistency. After we've kneaded the dough thoroughly, the most important thing is to make sure there are no pockets of flour left in it. After that, you can use disposable thin plastic bags, or you can use plastic wrap. The main point is that at this stage, you need to transfer the dough onto plastic wrap or into a bag, wrap it up very tightly, and then put it in the fridge to stabilize. Wrap the dough in plastic wrap several times to make sure it doesn't try, well, if you're using food wrap, so it doesn't try to escape anywhere while it's resting. That would be very unpleasant. That's it, the dough is ready. It goes into the refrigerator. After 12 hours, you can roll it out and bake it. So, the dough has rested in the refrigerator for 10 to 12 hours, and it's completely ready to work with. As you remember, it was very soft and very sticky when we wrapped it in plastic wrap. Now, as you can see and feel, it's very firm, it's stabilized, and it's completely ready to use. Here's what we have. The dough still has a slight stickiness on the surface. To make it easier to roll out, you'll need a small amount of flour. Don't flour the table too much, just enough to make rolling easier. Otherwise, you'll end up overloading the dough with flour. Dust a piece of dough with flour so it's comfortable to roll. Cut off a portion. And now we roll it out. First, press the dough down on the surface to give it a more convenient shape for rolling. If the dough sticks to your rolling pin while rolling, especially if you're using a wooden one, just dust the rolling pin with a little flour and keep rolling. Don't roll the dough out too thick or too thin. The thickness should be about 1/2 centimeter, a maximum of 1 centimeter, but ideally 5 millimeters. That will be enough, since the dough will rise a lot during baking. This thickness of dough will be just right for us. Lightly dust it with flour and brush off any excess. And now, use a cutter to make the gingerbread cookies. Gather up the excess dough. We'll need it again later. You need to work with the dough quickly because it gets softer as it warms up in the room. If you notice that the dough has become very soft, don't use flour. Just put the dough back in the fridge to let it firm up again. The color of the dough will depend a lot on the quality and amount of cinnamon you use. If you add more spices, the color will be darker and richer. The color of the gingerbread will also depend on how you bake it. It will get a bit darker during baking. Now, bake the gingerbread at 170 degrees Celsius and choose the top and bottom heat setting. Try not to use convection. Gingerbread doesn't like that.
The baking time will be between 12 and 15 minutes.
Keep an eye on your own oven. Alright, the gingerbread cookies are already baked, so now you can take them out.
Right now they're hot, so you definitely need to let them cool. You need to remove them, transfer them to a wire rack, and make sure to let them cool completely before glazing.
To make the glaze, we'll need powdered sugar, a few drops of lemon juice, and egg white.
Weigh out the powdered sugar. Now we'll add the egg white and start whipping.
We'll add a few drops of lemon juice for shine at the very end of mixing, along with the essential oil.
There you go. The glaze is ready.
Now you can add a drop of lavender oil. So, we've added the essential oil. Now we'll whip the mixture for just a few more seconds, and it will be ready to grace the gingerbread.
For convenience, we put 2/3 of the mixture into a container.
To the remaining 1/3 of the glaze, I'm going to add just a tiny drop of lemon juice and a bit of food coloring. Now let's mix it to dissolve the coloring in the glaze. This is the color we get. In this case, it's best to use powdered dry fruit coloring. You can use natural ones as well. The main part of the glaze is ready. Now I'll show you how you can quickly glaze a gingerbread cookie using the marbling technique. Drizzle a small stream of the colored glaze over the surface. Just a little bit. Then use a fork to create swirls. This is how it should look. Now take the gingerbread and carefully dip it in without going too far over the edges so the glaze doesn't overflow. But do it in a way that it evenly covers all sides. Rotate the gingerbread a little. Now take it out and gently tap it, maybe against your hand, to create a slight vibration so the excess glaze drips off. And slip it over. You can tap it a little more as needed. And you get this kind of pattern. If you get any unsightly bubbles on the surface of the glaze, don't worry. Just take a toothpick or a skewer and gently pop them. As long as the glaze hasn't set yet, you can do this without messing up the pattern. This way, you can glaze all the gingerbread cookies. And be sure to remember this important thing. If you make the glaze yourself using fresh egg whites, it takes a long time to dry, about 8 hours. The gingerbread cookies definitely need to dry out. If you use ready-made glaze, then you only need to let them dry for about 4 hours. Thank you.